Welcome to Agribusiness Matters. My name is Venki Ramachandran. Agribusiness Matters is an endeavor to discover systems thinking in food and agriculture systems in an age of runaway climate change. Today at Agribusiness Matters, I'm really excited to have Professor Ashwini Chhatre. Professor Ashwini Chhatre is a man of various hats, embodying the world of both research and action. I also found a lot of parallels in his journey, in that really made me also endear to this conversation. I don't want to make a very formal introduction because at the heart of this endeavor is to create really a human spaces for dialoguing on issues that are very complex and especially involving food and agriculture systems. So, without really taking much of an ado, I really want to kickstart this conversation by first of all thanking you very much, Professor, for taking the time to speak to us at Agribusiness Matters.
Thank you for inviting me. It's a delight. And as you can guess, I love talking about the stuff that we will talk about.
Great. So I really want to get on to the first question. I was looking at your profile. You had almost written this that I spent about 11 years more working as a community organizer and social activist, working on issues related to natural resource and food and water. Right. This is where probably the parallels that I was talking about. Right. That for people those who work in food and agriculture systems typically tend to gravitate between what is outside the system and inside the system far more. So maybe that's the first question to start off with is to really try and understand in what ways do you think spending this 11 years as a community organizer activist, in what ways did it shape your understanding of working in this kind of a landscape, especially with the initiatives of forest economy and the various initiatives that you're currently doing. In what ways that period of 11 years that you think has contributed to your current journey and your work that you're doing?
I took two main lessons, and I have, of course, carried them and I cherish them even today. The first lesson from that more than a decade of work was that there are incredibly smart people everywhere. And I met them in so many different places that I was surprised to find them because I come from a very privileged background. You may not see me, but let's say I'm a Brahmin, I'm a middle class, I go to good schools, sort of Delhi University and so on. And I expected from that high perch that I was smarter than others. And then, fortunately, I was open enough to acknowledge brilliance and intelligence when I saw it. And I was also very fortunate to have mentors who pointed it out to me. But the first big lesson that I learned early on and then I carried with me is that there are incredibly smart people, and if they are poor or look like they are not doing well, it's not because they are not smart or hardworking. It's because there is a suite of circumstances and structures that prevent them from achieving their own potential. And when someone does well, particularly in a rural society, that translates into the spreading of wealth and prosperity. Very few people in these kinds of sort of traditional network societies can benefit only themselves because they are embedded in these social networks and hierarchies. They are somehow bound to them, which also keep them sort of trapped in many ways. But if we can unleash that potential, these smart people can change not just their lives, but the lives of people around them as well. And I try to never forget that. And therefore, when I go out, I start with that assumption that there are several very smart people in all the places where I'm trying to do anything, whether it is food and agriculture or forests or any other topic. If I can reach these people and help them, then I won't have to do all the work that I think is needed. They will carry out most of it. The second big lesson that I took, and it is a running theme through all my research and publications, is incentives related to property rights. If you own a piece of land, property rights, the things that you own, the rights that you have to do with land or trees or forests and so on. And the clearer they are, the better they can be designed to create prosperity and to create wealth. And the individual will take care of the rest if you can align the incentives and the property rights appropriately. What I saw is most of the time, the incentive of the individual was not aligned with social objectives. So if you cut down a tree, it is at the expense of the community and the society. So you can only benefit by making the society poorer or worse off. And it is not necessarily a given. That need not be so. And there are many, many examples and several Nobel Prizes that have established how getting the property rights aligned correctly can lead to good outcomes. So, combined with smart people everywhere and property rights not aligned, allows me to imagine a future where we can put these two together and sort of create wealth, create prosperity, reduce poverty, regenerate forests. So many good things that we can do.
Yeah, I mean, I'm reminded of Fernandez de Soto's arguments around creating the property rights as the essential fulcrum. So yeah, as the foundation, I see his arguments very much talking about the same aspect here. If you don't mind me getting slightly into personal side of things for you, because I'm very curious at one level, right? When you say that when you've seen people who are working in there, right, there are generally two choices people make, right? Especially when you've seen the rich world of the rural world and kind of the way the systems organize and the way people organize themselves, right? One way is at one level, India has had a rich culture of protest. India has a rich culture of organizing people outside the systems, right? Outside the modes of ways the systems are there, right? So at one level, you could very well be a mobilizer of people and stay outside the system, working closer with the forest or working closer with, let's say, the rural India and building more alternative structures. That could be one way. The other could be another way where you are right now doing, where you are much more closer to the power, working with the powers of the government, working with the powers that be, working with working with the existing current systems, right? In whatever limitations they are and whatever current shape and structure that they are, but working to strive towards pushing the boundaries there, right? I'm not judging either of the two worlds. I'm simply exploring this question of, has there been a question of, in your kind of career, because you've traveled the both worlds, has there been a choice for you to consider whether you wanted to be, outside vis-a-vis inside the system in some sense?
I don't consider myself to be inside the system, but I work with the system now and not against the system. And that is the shift. But I do think of myself as not part of the system, at least not yet. You may disagree, or someone else looking from the outside may think I am part of the system. The way I saw it in terms of trajectory, in terms of evolution, is the mixture of Sangharsh and Nirman. So those are the two words that, and these are not my formulation. Shankar Guha Niyogi is one of my motivators and sort of inspiration, who led the Chhattisgarh Mines Shramik Sangh and was assassinated. He was the one who first came up with this proposal that protest alone will not change society for the better. After protest must come construction or reconstruction. And it cannot be a path going to a golden past. There was no golden past, there is only a golden future. and it has to be constructed, and it is our duty to do it. We cannot be satisfied with protest alone. Both are required. Like you said, there is no room to judge. We need both. And while I participated in the protest side for many years, for a decade, I also realized during that time that my strength is perhaps in setting up demonstration of an alternative future. And the more confident I became, and research was my preferred medium to do that, to acquire that confidence that this is something that I can do. I have the theory, I have the practice. Now I can try to put something together in small bits and pieces here and there that hint at what a good, prosperous future looks like. I don't know what that looks like in any clarity, but I have made that transition from protest to reconstruction, from Sangharsh to Nirman, in that spirit, in contributing to the construction of building blocks of what will become a good, prosperous, inclusive, equitable future.
Beautiful. I think you really hit the nail of what I was trying to explore there, because at one level there is always this sense, especially the reason why I was asking this question was also from the sense that there's always a certain sense of to what extent we have a formal and informal, that sort of especially when it comes to land rights and when it comes to, and I'm sure you have much more deeper context than I am, but there is always this tension that is there, and that's where this question is also coming in, because at one level, for me, as an outsider who's been trying to understand the political economy as a subject, the question of legibility and the work of seeing like a state, right? What James Scott seeing like a state are very seminal texts for me in terms of trying to understand what is the role of legibility and in the way we are trying to organize an economy, especially with respect to a forest economy. So, and that's where for me there was always this question of, like, when you say, especially in your paper, you talk about, or in one of your videos, you talk about that make the forest economy visible one small step at a time. And here also you're talking about that beautiful future, right? From Sangharsh to Nirman. There is always this question of to what extent we will keep things legible vis-a-vis illegible, right? Because traditionally we've always seen that whenever commons and spaces have to be managed, it has to be managed at an illegible certain core commons, right? The centrality of that place has to be at an illegible element. And I'm using the word illegible from the James Scott's understanding of the word legibility here. So from that sense, I was always very intrigued by that question of, when you're saying again, making forest economy visible, are we making it legible enough for the state, or into what extent can we still maintain the illegibility of the forest economy? Because it's not just a linear extractive economy, right? So that question was always there in my top of the mind whenever I was exploring this question there. So, and that's one of the reasons where I had to give all the context for all of these questions here.
Well, so two thoughts. The first is, I never forget that James Scott was an anarchist. So he's coming from a specific philosophical position. When he looks at upland people and the state's effort at making these landscapes legible, it is from the point of view of extraction. And he is absolutely correct. What the state sees is through the lens of political economy. What will benefit the interests that are dominant in the state? It was timber in the mid-19th century. It was irrigation in the early 20th century. It became timber once again after independence in India, particularly the Himalayas, massive deforestation, and so on. That is one way to think about legibility. I want to think about it differently. have turned it on its head. The problem also is that the local community themselves don't have legibility on the resource that they are sitting on. They don't know how valuable it is. They don't know what they can do if they had the necessary support and the property rights and the capital that perhaps it is possible to imagine. If it was more legible to them, then they would be the ones who would protect the forests from deforestation or from logging or from illegal activities. If we think about legibility in that inverted fashion, it's not about whether it is legible to the state or not. Is it legible to the people who live there? And it is very often not. It's not, I mean, this is a lived experience of mine, is that when we, in many, many landscapes, in Himachal Pradesh, in Maharashtra, in Odisha, in Jharkhand, in Gujarat, when we have started working with communities and using tech to help them visualize their own forest, it changes their motivation completely. Because they had never seen it from that perspective. They had never seen the forest as a source of jobs and wealth and prosperity. They had always seen it as a last resort, as a sort of a safety net, as a bank in which sort of there exist some resources that are available in some seasons when there is nothing else available. Okay? So that's one. To invert the idea of visibility is that do the communities see the forest for what it is capable of producing? And once they do, they behave very differently. The second is the sort of 24th year of the 21st century. And I sort of try to make sure that I am always thinking in the present because it's very easy to stay in the past.
Sure.
The private sector now, so I will look at the forest economy. We actually don't, because if you look at your own house, if you turn around and look, there are so many things, so many ingredients in so many aspects of your daily life where the raw materials were first acquired, collected, or harvested from a forest somewhere in the country. Right? And when you look at your hand lotion, when you look at your soaps, when you look at your books, the paper, and so much in our, and we value nature. When something is natural, we are willing to pay a premium for it. When something is wild, we are willing to pay a premium for it. But at the end of that value chain is a poor woman who is collecting seeds that are fallen to the forest floor in 45 degrees Celsius heat. That is a different level of invisibility, right? We are willing, we have accepted that natural is better, wild is good, compared to synthetic and plastic and so on. But the people who are at the end of that, the first mile of that value chain are invisible. So I also want to increase that visibility. It's the people who will not just benefit from the forest, but who will also make sure that the forests are protected and that they are regenerated.
Yeah, I agree with it. It's a very fascinating way of when you put it in terms of inverting the idea of legibility at its head, because so far we've always looked at least I've had a sort of a mental perception based on my reading of obviously by James Scott, that James Scott also talks about those ideas of metis, right? That whenever the invisible illegibility of local economies, and they have their own set of practices that replenish them, and so when you make them legible and for the right reasons that you're pointing out in terms of both for the people and for the community and also for the people who are involved in the aggregation, it demands a more enlightened form of governance, right? And
it's possible. It's possible. We are trying to establish that it is possible.
Yeah, and that's exactly, a sense. In fact, in your paper, there is this word that really left me underlying it in many ways. You say this thing that forests continue to be perceived as spaces of conservation, right? We aim to invert this logic. At one level, it seemed like a very high leap of faith, in a certain sense of, like as I said, it's a certain kind of an enlightened form of governance. It is possible, but the kind of structures and governance structures have to be doubly strengthened, right? In terms of for these kind of systems to put in place for them to evolve to adapt to this, right?
I disagree. I don't think they need to be strengthened. I think they first need to be recognized. That is where the Metis comes in. The Koya Adivasis of Malkangiri in Odisha have their own system that is built on their traditions. What we need is to first recognize these traditions, respect them, before we build anything. If we take a cookie cutter approach and say, okay, this is what worked in Gadchiroli and therefore we will impose it on every forest everywhere, that is precisely the wrong kind of structure that we want to build. It has to be bottom up. So first we have to recognize that if there are forests left somewhere, we should not be trying to protect them from the people who live there, because if they didn't want those forests would not have survived. If the forests are still there, it's because of these people, not in spite of them.
Yeah, in many ways, apologies if I bring in a slightly informal metaphor here, right? At one level, the climax of Kantara ends with a nice fantasy of the god touching, holding hands with the police, and at some level that seems like the idealistic vision, right? Where we are, because you're in some sense you also talk about a tripartite relationship, right? So again, I'm not again trying to, I completely understand that the need to set up these structures at individual local ones and recognize that the people who have been building in here. The question is only in terms of, do we have the right, because typically whenever we try to embolden a certain structures with a newer form of technologies there, somewhere at its implementation level, some of these gateways gets converted into some kind of an illegibility, right? Like even though we might have digitized the passport access seva, there's still somebody who's coming at the local key counter and who's giving us a ticket, and he'll try to convert it to an illegibility, right? And that has largely been the pattern we've seen across whenever we try to bring in systems that try to work at the last mile and the edges there. So I really don't want to come across as a cynic person, but I'm really trying to see in what ways can we really strengthen this this endeavor of having these local economy plays and supporting them in their endeavors, and for them to hold the commons there.
Well, I tend to think of as a competition between romance and hubris. And I don't want to be either, but it's important for me to be aware of it, and I would like to share what I see. So the romance is that there are these communities that have been living in harmony with nature, and if we recognize their sustainable, traditional, customary management practices, all will be well, and they will sort of make themselves prosperous, and the world will be a better place. And that is the romance. And who doesn't like romance? We all like romance. It's a very nice aspiration to have. And with all the caveats, etc., but that is the romance. And then there is the hubris side. Is that we know that there is a very high spatial correlation between forests and poverty, and Adivasis and so on. We believe that after 100 years or even 150 years of failure, or let's say even 75 years of failure since independence, we will continue to do what we did that has failed in the past, in the spirit of protecting the forest from these people by giving them livelihoods that takes them away from the forest, by giving them alternatives that does not require the forest in any way at all, so that the forests will be rendered safe, protected by who? By forest guards who are sort of very easy to buy, literally, right? In a political economy of rent seeking, where I mean we have Veerappan and sort of all kinds of other things going on, we have the hubris of continuing to believe that we need to help these people and to do it in a way that takes them away from their forest, that we don't need the forest to remove their poverty. I'm just amazed at the ease with which we swallow this pill. What kind of hubris allows us to think that this is actually possible after 75 years of failure? It's not for lack of trying. So there's this romance, and we don't want to fall for that, but there's also this hubris that we need to get out of, to break. Is that the forests are a space of production, and there are people who know these forests better than anyone else, including forest guards. Can we use that information, that knowledge, that sort of traditional customary practices and build something that actually helps them? That is where I'm coming from. This is somewhere balancing the romance and the hubris.
No, beautifully put. I think, yeah, in a way, I completely resonate with having been victim at both ends of that kind of thinking there, because at one level, the more you delve into the subject, you realize that the kind of layers and the administrative layers we have built in this system makes it all at one level either trust on only both either sides. It's like when you're in an uncertain environment, you either become a theist or an atheist. So at one level it makes us either go into binary opposites, right? And for instance, you are making a very, very slight of a point by talking about saying that what was working in Gadchiroli cannot be extended to the state. So I completely understand the back end of point of what you're trying to say, in terms of, while at one level we have the CFR based, there have been people CFR, and from at one level, while it started from that particular village, Menda, so from that specific village, from there it has grown. In many ways, we have still not yet progressed to really seeing the CFR titles actually being credited on the ground. So, are you saying this balance can be achieved by issuing the CFR titles at the local level and creating these structures that makes it easier for them to participate? Like, which is what your I saw your JAR FRA app. I was also playing with it to see if I can to get it, but the access was too strong for me to get inside. But are these ways for you to, are you seeing these as ways to create these kind of digital decentralized ways of governance to move this forward?
Yes. So the CFR title is a means to an end. It's a tool. It's not an end in itself. It's important to remember that. The objective there is security of tenure. When it comes to farmers, we are very clear that if you are a tenant, you will not invest in the land. If you are an owner, you will invest in the land. You will make sure that it improves in productivity. You will sort of care for it in a way that sort of improves its productivity in the future. A tenant will not do that. A wage worker will not do that. So security of tenure, we fully understand when it comes to farmers. I only want to translate that same fundamental principle to forests, that if the communities don't have security of tenure, why should they protect the forest? That's where it is coming from. And CFR is just the legal mechanism to do it. There can be other legal mechanisms, and we are open to that. But the central objective is security of tenure. We cannot expect the farmer to take care of the land if he doesn't know tomorrow the agriculture department will take it away from him. It's exactly the same. We cannot expect the community to care for the forest if they are not sure that the forest department will take it away from them. That is what CFR does, nothing else. And there are other ways to do it. We are using CFR because there are state governments that are already committed to doing this, and it works really well for achieving that purpose, security of tenure. That's one. The second is, again, going back to the first point, is that CFR is a tool, it's not an end in itself. If you get title, if you are a community in some remote part of Jharkhand, Simdega district, let's say, you get title. What are you going to do with it? There's nothing you can do. So title is useless. What we need is to combine it with aggregation economies. If you don't have aggregation economies, you can't create economies of scale. You can't exploit the efficiencies of technology. Which is what farmers are also realizing, right? Which is what FPOs are set to do. Aggregation economies and efficiencies of scale. Nothing else. And it's very powerful. It doesn't need to be anything else. It's very powerful. So when it comes to farmers, we are fully convinced. But the same logic, it takes a long time for people to wrap around when it comes to forests. Because we tend to think of forest as something that needs to be protected. Right? The third thing that we need to do, and this is something that FPOs are also beginning to understand, is it is, no matter how smart these people are, it is unreasonable to have an FPO of, let's say, 5,000 farmers from 20 villages, forest producer company, not a farmer producer company, to actually compete in the market for capital or clients, buyers of their produce, to compete with the marketing budgets of Patanjali and Dabur and Hindustan Unilever. What are you talking about? It does not, it will take years for them to actually get there.
Yeah, and they are not even, we're not even looking at the capacity structures for also to help them do that.
And it takes time to build that capacity in-house, right? The people who will start today, their children will go to college and potentially MBAs and come back and become managers, and then they will provide the kind of leadership that we aspire sometime in the next generation. But until then, the way to support them is to link them to industrial value chains, because these same companies are buying these forest products through the invisible, informal, disaggregated supply chains. So if we make them visible, if we connect these large companies who buy forest-based raw material directly to the community-based enterprises, then we actually make it possible for these enterprises to become competitive, to become profitable, and to learn how to do things without having to deal with the marketing of their products. They should produce raw material because they are good at it. It's just that they have not done it at scale. They do it individually. If 5,000 of them do it collectively, many things are possible, just like farmers.
No, you make very, very interesting aspects that I want to delve into. You've touched upon many interesting aspects. Maybe I'll come to the first point, which is you talked about at one level, you were saying that while the same logic of aggregation economies apply to FPO, the moment we think about it for the forest, our minds get slightly, becomes hard and difficult to wrap, right? Because at one level, we still have a certain sense that forest is that the conservation mindset is very much there, and there is also a sense that aggregation, agriculture can overtake in terms of the bigger pie for food and agriculture. So essentially, if your vision and what you're saying holds true, we are actually rethinking the whole binary discussion that has been happening around land conservation, land sparing, all of that into a very new light, right? Because of what you're saying is to be put into a larger systems perspective. Because for a long time we were of the mindset that certain areas are better for land sparing, and certain areas have to be accelerated and increased in scale for land, and that's been the traditional industrial agriculture's mindset also in many ways there. But from that, now we are transitioning to a mode where, especially with the advent of regenerative, that we have to increase both the production systems and also maintain them sustainably. So, in what ways are you seeing the overall systems approach to change in respect to for your this kind of a framework to come true here in treating both food and agriculture systems simultaneously in context with forest?
There are so many ways, but I will talk about one overarching framework that I work with, which is multifunctional landscapes. So when we think of forest, this is how sort of media has trained us, brainwashed us, if I may. When we think of forest, we think of this pristine, large Amazon, Congo, Borneo kind of forest with orangutans and that kind of stuff, and very primitive people who are hunter-gatherers. That is at the back of our mind when we hear the word forest.
Yeah, which David Graeber has sufficiently dislodged, at least in my head.
Some of us have become smarter, let's say, but because of the mainstreaming of conservation, that is what comes to mind when we think of forest, right? And that actually invisibilizes the people who are in that forest. The women who are collecting the sal seeds and the mahua seeds, we know about it, but we don't put it together. So when we use a soap or hand lotion or Dabur Amla Kesh Tel, we don't think of where that Amla came from. Right?
Assuming that there was an Amla
collected
used
in the
in the first
wild.
place.
First, we have to remember that Amla is actually a tree, then we have to remember that it grows in the wild, and so on and so forth. Now, in India, we don't have these large landscapes. Pristine, to forget about it. What we have is fragmented landscapes with a lot of people and agriculture interspersed with small patches of forest that are linked together somewhat tenuously. So there is a human-dominated multifunctional landscape that provides habitat to wildlife of all kinds, livelihoods to people, that combines agriculture and forest, and it would not be as productive if it was only agriculture or only forest. They are interconnected ecologically in ways that are only beginning to understand. Right? So this is not the Amazon pristine forest. This is not the Congo forest. This is not the Borneo forest. There are a few patches like that in India, but 90% of forest in India is highly fragmented, small patches that are just barely connected to each other. Now, if we start thinking of this as a landscape, most of the agriculture that is practiced there is rain-fed and not technologically very advanced. Right? It doesn't use a lot of good seed varieties. It doesn't use a lot of even 1960s technology. Very little fertilizer use, almost no pesticide use, and so on. These soils are very poor, low nitrogen, low zinc, low phosphate, you name it. It's very poor nutrient soils. Now, the kind of productivity that we see in these agricultural lands is because of the contributions of forests. They provide the pollinators, they provide the nutrients, they recycle the nutrients that then get washed into these landscapes. Right? And it has evolved over a long time. It's not new in the Indian landscape. That is where the jhuk cultivation tradition comes from. Right? Where the forest is the fertilizer.
Yeah.
Every 5 years, you cut down the forest which provides the fertilizer. It has been growing for 5 years. Now, of course, because of the population density, shifting cultivation is no longer viable, and I am not suggesting that we should go back to it. But that is no reason for us to not think about forests as fertilizer production factories. They are the best nitrogen suppliers. All they have to do is produce leaves. And if we can integrate forests into the agricultural systems in forested landscapes, we won't need to go through the mistakes of the Green Revolution. If we create more productive forests, people will start taking care of them and they will in turn contribute to increasing the productivity of the agriculture. We have to think of it as a landscape. And a multifunctional landscape. It's not just agriculture, it's not just forests, it's both.
Yeah, I think while it's a tantalizing possibility, the only struggle, at least well, I'm trying to put in as I wrap this in my head is the moment we think about economies of scale, there is a certain mindset of something that has been over harvested, like as you use the word in your paper also, something that's over harvested to the point of really bleaching the soil and to that extent, right? So to what extent multifunctional keeping the limits in balance is where I think one of the fundamental first challenges is coming in, right? And especially if we are talking about a network of, let's say, a multiple functioning, multi-purpose functioning forest there, right? To what extent will there be a dynamic balance, right? Because I mean, one of the very first question I really wanted to ask you was this idea that at one level, organizing the forest economy seems like a paradoxical statement, because there is no such thing that is as organized entity in a forest, right? There's no, so they are all things are evolving and come together, and there is some kind of a balance that emerges out of it. So now any attempt where from our end to put in a balance always runs the human mindset risk of getting to its excess there. So that is where somewhere the difficulties of right now in putting this balance is where is also coming in from.
It's so I will put it differently. It's the balance is an outcome. What we need is checks that create regulatory systems that are transparent. So the deforestation happened when, the Himalayas were deforested in the 1960s and 70s. It was not because we didn't know that cutting down whole hillsides is good for the hillside. Nobody at that time thought that, oh, it's not going, it doesn't matter. But it still happened because the checks were not there. And the people who were living near the forest had no power and no authority and no incentive to do anything about it. Right? Of course, Chipko did it anyway, but that is an exception in terms of the entire Himalayan landscape. The same thing happened
even in South. This happened the
forest.
Same.
That's exactly. So if we have the checks in place, the regulatory systems, and make it transparent, because right now decision making around forests is not transparent. And if we are able to do that, and again, 21st year of the 21st century, digital technology should allow us to do that.
Yeah, so which is where I want to go back to your earlier point also, that you said that the CFRs at one level are a means to an end, right? And while we see Jairam Ramesh often now bemoaning in Twitter about that it has not yet reached its potential, it has not really reached its potential, and in many ways now, especially with the Forest Conservation Amendment Act of 2023, right? There has been significant amount of attempts in the definition of forest itself, right? So while the Global Forest Watch data shows that there have been almost more than 23,300 square kilometers of tree cover come down in India. At another level, there is government data showing with all the global satellite data showing that there is marginal increase in forest cover, right? There is very fundamental elements of what is what is even the definition of forest, right? Do we go back to the original definition of which is what used in the Godavarman judgment case, right? which is the original definition of which is used a dictionary term, but used in a very expansive way in that judgment? Or do we go back to the current 2023 Amendment Act, where we said that only which is passes the 1927 Forest Act, all of those will constitute the forest. So when these kind of fundamental ontological questions come in, how do you think that we could probably put these systems in place?
I would like to go beyond that. So the problem that you are pointing to, definition of forest, for example, should it be 1927 Indian Forest Act definition or 1980 Forest Conservation Act definition? Where does Supreme Court fall given the Godavarman case? I think all of that comes from a zero-sum game approach.
Okay.
And what I'm talking about is that it is a positive sum game.
Okay.
The zero-sum game is the following, that if you benefit from the forest will lose.
Come again?
I can only benefit from the forest, as society can only benefit from the forest at the cost of the forest. What I am proposing is that it is a positive sum game, is that we can benefit from a growing forest. Until now, we have actually not even considered that possibility.
Yeah. See, last year I was in Switzerland, and there we saw that, at least I saw that there were these community-based structures, right? And where at least the government was in actively incentivizing. At one level, there was a federal structures of counties being created, and at another level, the government is also subsidizing them at that level. So, do you think? Again, I don't want to sound again as cynical here, but in what ways do you think this positive sum can really be enforced? Do we have the right administrative structures in place?
We have the administrative structures, we don't have the political will. So where there is political will, that is where we start. So we are working in places where the political leadership has accepted this premise and are willing to work with us to set up demonstrations. We have to show it. No? Otherwise, after a point, it's just an argument. You can always argue for it.
And that's exactly why I was excited to talk to you, because you're already working on the ground to bring in there. So from Jharkhand and Orissa and all, are you seeing a certain level of mature political vision that is enabling this happen?
Yes. Himachal Pradesh, Andhra Pradesh. And sometimes it is the district level that percolates up. Sometimes it is the state level leadership that percolates down. But there is openness to the idea. Openness not just to the idea in terms of, okay, let's talk about it over a drink, but okay, let's do it. That level.
Yeah, because at one level, it's very difficult to even wrap this aspect here in many levels, because we are used to we've not really seen this kind of a vision play out in any other context there, especially for a kind of country of that kind of complexity in India here. Right? It is we tend to see that yes, it has worked in other countries and other places because of their smaller levels of complexity.
And smaller countries.
Smaller countries also, yes.
It's easy to do something.
Yeah. No.
I think the action is at the state level. Before it goes to the central government, the action is at the state level. That is where politicians are much more sensitive to and responsive to good ideas. If they can see how it can be translated into political credit and potentially re-election. That is what they care about.
No, but maybe could you expand a little bit more on the political vision and how does it translate on the ground level, right? Like for instance, very recently when I read Karthik Muralidharan's book on the governance of India, right? He talks largely about the implementation inabilities. right? In terms of the capacity level weakness there and number of resources we put in place for administrative governance, whereas India has largely been understaffed. So, and even when I was doing research for this, I saw that the Ministry of Tribal Affairs, the amount of resources that we have in place at the nodal level, joint secretary level, resources are still minimal. So, could you maybe give me a sense of let's say when a state like say Himachal Pradesh or Orissa or anyone, it comes on board with a strong political intent. It could be at different levels of the hierarchy, as you rightly said. From there to translate into a ground level, what does that kind of transition really look like?
It's not really a transition. So this idea that we fail in implementation, of course, obviously true. So there's no point in saying it's not true, but is also one-sided.
Okay.
Because we often don't pay attention to things that we have done exceedingly well. We vaccinated 1 billion people twice in 6 months with a cold chain. I can come up with many examples. When we want to do something, when we figure out that this is something that we need to do, we will do it. So it's not for lack of ability. It's for lack of will. And if we get everyone facing in the same direction, we can do great things, and we have.
Yeah, no, but could you give me maybe get maybe some specifics in terms of like, does this may entail because see today there is a fundamental power play also, right? And when it comes to politics, there is fundamental power play happening, where at one level forest departments are feeling they are the plug is being pulled back from their end, especially with the kind of CFR rights that are being talked about, right? And so now joint forest management activity committees are being formed, and so some states are opposing to it. So all kinds of complexities each state is putting their own set of spin into it, right? You are far more familiar than I am on this. So in this kind of a power play kind of a game, I really don't want to leave it at a very idealistic level. I really want to get down to some specifics in terms of in what ways do you think this kind of vision could really translate? Does it involve empowering the tribal ministry act equally alongside the forest? And how does that translation would look like if you were to look at a state-wise blueprint?
I will tell you one thing. You can read it in my memoirs. All of this is ongoing political shenanigans. So I'm not going to talk about it on a podcast that is going to be made public tomorrow. Right? So please forgive me for not sharing details about how these trade-offs and compromises are being made in the states where we are working. But I will give you other examples. Some of it is failure, some of it is the time horizons. I am not sure how old you are, but I was working when the 73rd Constitutional Amendment was put into place, right, 1993. And the first state acts that incorporated the amendment were 94, and the first elections after the amendment with the 1/3 reservation for women took place in 95. Then in 2000, then in 2005, 2010, and so on. Right? So now we are in the 7th generation or 8th generation of women who have been elected. And I have seen that trajectory, that growth, that development, that evolution. In 1995, 96, 97, all conversation was about what a waste it was that the women were not able to do anything. In any case, their husbands were acting as the sarpanch, and these were the sarpanch puppies or some other words in local languages and so on. And it was true for the most part. Right? It was not until the election of 2005, the third election, when girls who were 10 to 15 years old in school when the first women were elected in 1995, stood for election on their own steam, on their own strength, with perhaps husbands that supported them, because husbands had also changed in those 10 years. There was a shift in how women elected leaders in the panchayat were seen. And by 2010, it was very clear that there was a whole generation of women who grew up seeing women as elected leaders and thought, that was normal. By 2015, it was very clear that women were equally competent and equally corrupt. There was no difference between men and women. Right? But they required that one generation. It was the women who were strong and provided leadership in 2015 were toddlers when the constitutional amendment was done. We have to give the forest economy an equal amount of time. Because it will be the generation that is toddlers now who will show us what the strength of the forest economy is. And then they will be the politicians, they will be the leaders.
Yeah, I see your point.
It is not a project.
Sorry?
It is not a project. It will not get over in 5 years.
No, I deeply thank you for sharing this. At one level, we are harvesting the seeds of potential there, and that's where at one level, while some of these aspects are showing us possibilities there. My interest was largely to also to kind of get a see, because today, even in FPOs, and there we are seeing a lot more significant shift in among the top leading FPOs, especially in Telangana and many places. We've had women leaders coming into the fund, and we still are. We are starting to see some of the results there, especially in the agri community. There's largely the sense that men have no hope left, because it's only women who can really drive forward with a certain level of leadership and agenda. Otherwise, it's funny as a man to say this, but the ecosystem has largely given up hope on men, considering where they are in the current in the agricultural world of things. Great. In many ways, this conversation is also taking me to interesting aspects of, like, when you're talking about these kinds of because in a nutshell, what you're pointing out is also that we are talking about the fledgling, what we talk about as infant economies, right? And this kind of you are also putting the seeds in one way to look at your approach, and your paper is also to put these infant economies in place. And so when you are looking about these infant economies in place, are you also I'm again going back to the previous question which I asked in a different way. Are you sort of envisaging how this infant economy would scale in, and are you sort of seeing some scale-based variant elements of administrative elements? Because I remember you are also in a country like India, we have multiple levels of administrative complexity. So are you seeing some elements that will become very, very active once we reach a certain scale, because you're talking about infant economies here?
So one parallel that I think of is the semiconductor economy in Taiwan. It was zero in 1960. It was world leader in 1980. And it took a lot of public action. The government took concerted action in collaboration with a number of other private sector and civil society actors. They invested in it in a very concerted manner. It was not planned, but it was concerted. There were all kinds of missteps and setbacks, and so it was not a sort of infinite positive growth story as we like to believe now. But when you actually look at the semiconductor economy, it was infant. It was sort of nothing in 1960. And who would have thought? But it took foresight.
Mm.
And there are so many other examples like this.
Mm.
So where it will happen is like Silicon Valley. There will be one state or hopefully a few states which will start to benefit from this. Think about the Indian Electricity Act in 2003 combined with CDM. A few states had the foresight. So think about Tamil Nadu, think about Gujarat. They invested in wind with feed-in tariffs, with power purchase agreements, and they attracted a lot of investment. The private sector worked with the government, and they had that foresight, right? Who would have thought? But other states were watching, and they were laggards, and they came in later.
No, so maybe let me rephrase this question in a slightly different way. At one level, in response to climate change, today at a bare minimal, at a bare bones level, people are very clear that the response will also have to be at a local community centric level responses, right? And even in agriculture, we are out right now discovering that bioregions or that whatever is a unit atomic element at a village level, at a block level, that is the most ideal response, right? So in this kind of a context, are you also saying that that is the only way forward? Where even for a climate change, because today you see ERCAD establishing their own climate resilience plan, and different states are now also setting up their own plans. So at one level, the atomic unit element in terms of the way the block at which they will decide the administrative elements, that is getting more and more localized. So the same approach would still further continue is how you see in the forest economy scheme of things.
On some dimensions, yes. Climate change is a complex beast. So there will have to be a state level and national level response. We cannot avoid that. We cannot actually respond to climate change and adapt to it, or at least deal with it in a way that doesn't destroy us without this multi-level, multi-scalar response. But let's say we want to put in place for want of a better word, carbon neutral economy. Right? Low carbon rural development. And there are all these buzzwords that go around. It has to be built on sources of energy that are not fossil fuels. We cannot have development without energy. Where is this energy going to come from? We are fixated on solar and wind and now increasingly on nuclear. And they all have their place, that's fine. But what about ethanol? What about compressed biogas? So CBG is indistinguishable from CNG. And it's great. Now there is a dense network of pipelines across India managed by GAIL, Gas Authority of India Limited. What do forests produce? Biomass, most of all, right? And there will be trade-offs with ecology, and we have to be careful that they don't become factory farms for nitrogen or for biomass and so on. But because they are natural nutrient recyclers, nothing grows nitrogen better than forests. And if we can capture it and channel it into making ethanol, into making biogas, into making biofertilizer, all of these are substitutes for fossil fuels. So the energy for development must come from somewhere that is not fossil fuels. And without energy, there is no development.
Yeah. So this substitution part is where, I mean, it's very, I did read this part in your paper also. Because at one level we are envisaging some kind of a transitioning phase, right? Like wherever we are use hydrocarbon based ones, we are then transitioning to a newer element. Like, and in your paper also you give various examples from using the ones which involve typically petrochemicals, when from then to using a natural way and based. Now the alternatives, but at one end have always been the question of scale, and that's where whenever you have to replace them with there, the question of scale in there. So are you saying that when this transition would, along with when these products get replaced from one end to other end, we will eventually, this transition is inevitable, and so we will eventually build these things at scale also, is what you're saying?
It's not inevitable. It is not inevitable by any means. What you see, for example, ethanol, just to take an example, has very serious food security trade-offs. The ethanol technology, first generation ethanol technology, developed from the Midwestern United States that was growing corn, right? Or from Brazil that was growing sugarcane. And this was sort of pre-climate change era, right? We didn't think about land, or at least they didn't think about land. We did. Now, we cannot afford to put arable land into non-food crops. In the future, we need to protect this land for growing food. We cannot grow sugarcane on it, we cannot grow maize on it to produce ethanol. It has to come from non-arable land. That is why forests are so important for the future of energy. Otherwise, we will create food security trade-offs. And that technology developed because corn was already a dominant crop. And even today in India, 99% of our ethanol comes from sugar, molasses, rice, and maize. Terrible idea. What we need is the second generation.
Subsidizing it.
Exactly. And we have, as a country, as a government, we need to make that conscious decision that we need to invest in technology that is useful for us, not borrow it from the West, because it was developed for a very different political economy and resource constraint. Our resource constraints are different. We cannot afford to compromise food security because of climate change.
Yeah, it's an extremely important argument here, because today there are only two ways in which people are envisaging, right? Two scenarios people are envisaging. One is we replace our current energy sources with some alternative energy sources that lets us continue, or we rapidly demand downscale our demands. So in which case, you're saying that at least from a countries wise individually, for them to keep continuing growing at their pace, they can still go for these transition products and continue to build on these technologies there. That's where you're pointing out from here, right?
Yeah.
Okay. Great. I think there are various aspects that I have covered in here, but I think so far this conversation has been very, very deeply interesting, and it did go into various areas that I hadn't planned out, and it didn't go into areas that probably I thought we should go into, but we couldn't go in. Nevertheless, in when you are also dealing with a food system stage, right? Because we talked a lot about on the forest side. I also want to equally focus on a little bit, because in the way you are putting together the pieces of the puzzle together, the food and agriculture have to be intertwined in some way. So, in what ways do you think, today, because today the larger set of agribusiness worlds don't respect for a buyers who would say that I follow a sustainable practices. I have let's say an aggregation of scale. And let's say I have a women producer cooperative. And then I'm giving you the best sourced lac, let's say, for producing the moisturizer, for producing the coating for a fruit, right? Today, the buyer doesn't value that. Right. So from a demand end and from a buyer's end perspective, in what are the structures in which we need to change to reward some of these practices there?
I don't think consumers are going to play a big role in a direct way, like it did in the conservation of tuna, for example, or orangutans and so on, or whales. I doubt that consumers will play a similar role here. But there is a clear indirect channel of influence. And it's the same with decarbonization. It's partly coming from securing your supply chains. Right? So there are some sectors that depend on forests. They cannot do without it. They are the ones who will be the leaders because they want to secure their supply of bamboo, their supply of lac, their supply of sal seeds or currant or neem or amla or whatever it is that their business depends on, their product depends on it. They would want to secure future supplies. They would be the ones to invest in systems that they can trust and then pass on that trust to the consumers that, hey, we are investing in sustainable forest management so that not only we can continue to run our business and profits in the future, but you can also contribute or feel good that you are contributing to sustainable forest management. And the consumer, while unwilling to pay more, is willing to provide brand loyalty on that. So the leaders will start setting up reputations on this basis. And there will be a virtuous cycle, where companies will compete on how good they are in protecting forests on behalf of their consumers.
Yeah, which is where the scope 3 emissions were supposed to be tied on. But we still today, to a large extent, while the biodiversity markets are still emerging but they haven't reached a sufficient level of maturity to tackle with these kind of challenges in there, right?
The carbon markets, I'm not very hopeful until these are jurisdictional and compliance markets. The voluntary carbon market is very, very fragile and sort of very mercurial, very temperamental. And of course, the collapse of Vera is not helping. So there are no trustworthy certificates that are available that companies can get behind.
Yeah. See, while I really want to be optimistic about this shared vision of what you're pointing out in terms of where the local communities themselves are realizing the value and legibility of the systems that they are protecting in terms of the forest and our lung system, which collectively determine the fate of the ecosystem. What we have largely seen historically in the recent times also, that whenever there are some crisis happens, behaviors immediately start to shift, right? Like for instance, until very recently, Google was talking a lot about their sustainability goals, but suddenly when AI came into the picture, the race for AI, their sustainability targets went off the hill, right? Similarly, we saw countries like Indonesia talk about palm oil and say that our orangutans are gone, not going to be endangered and there. But now then there is now an export determined game because India is now starting to increase its import of grow its palm oil, and we are now setting up palm oil plantations and there. So in how are you seeing the some of these kind of decisions and transitions aspects also, these kind of shocks in place there, right? For instance, let's take the specific case of the plantation as a sector, right? Until now, we were fairly blasé about the fact that we were okay to be importing so much of the edible oil. But now, with suddenly as climate change looms into factor and we all want to be self-sufficient, we are now starting to increase our production of plantation especially for palm oil and oil palm, right? Do you see plantation or these kind of ones that are very strategic, they would go outside this framework? Or how do you see coexistence of plantation and this forest economy simultaneously?
There will inevitably be some overlap and it will be contentious. I'm convinced that extension of a plantation economy into the forests will be a bad idea, like it was a bad idea. So we saw what happened with eucalyptus plantations in the 1980s. Fortunately, that have been mostly rolled back to a great extent, although it still sort of shows up every once in a while.
It shows up in rural India often when we travel.
Yes. I believe that the plantation economy has the greatest potential and promise on private agricultural lands. And that will require a different model of capitalization. So, smaller holdings that should not be growing crops in any case. Annual crops on these upland, sloping, low nutrition soil is a bad idea to start with. But we do it because these are poor people who depend on whatever little they can get from these lands. But if we can create a fiscal ecosystem that rewards in some way, and of course, fiscal doesn't fully apply here, but if we bring in sort of capitalization logic, if we can bring in capital to be invested in these lands for growing plantations, then trees are the best things to be grown there. These lands are meant to be grown trees, but they will never be forests in that sense. The forests should be left to themselves to produce what they do best, which is a mixture of many things. And that is where their productivity is high. So if we reduce it to one thing, which is what a plantation is, we will be losing out on the benefit of what a forest can do. So there will be a distinction, and it's already quite clear if you look at the landscape and the trends. Plantation economy is growing on private lands, especially on rain-fed private lands. Palm oil can do very well there. On forest lands, although there will be some encroachment and some governments will try to generate plantations in forests, it will be contentious, people will protest, it is a bad idea, but more or less these will remain separate.
Yeah, it's a very interesting point you're making because we are seeing much more private private farmland investing is also increasing in there, and we seeing lands acquisition and land consolidation also happening in many parts in many places. So and probably with the advent of farmland investing, probably yes, these areas could come in there. But don't you think the whole idea of what I was trying to explore was in your framework of how you are envisaging the forest futures, is there any other supplementarity element of reimagining plantation system? Because we still have a colonial baggage of the word plantation itself.
It's important. So see, there is this term. It's quite beautiful and sort of it's not misleading. It's called assisted natural regeneration. Okay. So in the tropics, the forest is really fertile in terms of its natural capabilities. Even if there is no tree, you leave it alone for 5 years, it will be full of saplings because the birds will bring some seeds and there will be some rootstock that will start coming out of nowhere. It will surprise you. And of course, there are so many hundreds of examples of that happening where people have just closed off a forest and in 5 years it is sort of full of saplings. It needs to be assisted in a way that maintains the motivation of the people who are responsible for protecting it. So they need some wages, they need some direct benefits, maybe not in the short term, in the 5 years, but it will behoove us to take that into account so that we plant some bamboo somewhere and sort of some other local species that also provide livelihoods, that also provide income. That is the assisted natural regeneration part. So plantation will be important. The millions of hectares of barren forest lands that we have will not regenerate themselves. And if people are to do it, they will need some direct visibility of benefits. If not today, then at least a few years later.
Yeah, I think, in many ways, while there is immense possibilities for all of us to really reimagine a positive world, but increasingly, to hold that kind of optimism in the kind of developments that are there is where the real challenge is. So on that precarious balance between or balance between optimism, the romance, and the hubris that you talked about, I think I'll probably stop my questioning there. I also want to acknowledge Vishal, who's there, and I do bug him often to in respect to the conversation here. Vishal, I also invited him to this conversation because he's, since he was largely instrumental in making this conversation happen here. Thank you. Thank you, Professor, for really taking the time and answering my questions to the best of possible where, and even though when I could probe into you certain elements and you could also honestly stating where you are, you will not be able to go in further. Thank you very, very much. I really deeply appreciate it. And and hopefully we get to see more these developments and get to see more of these models that actually shows that this kind of beyond the zero sum, a set of a positive sum way, this is really possible in nature. I really like to believe that and hope that this will get implemented on the ground. Thank you.
Thank you very much. It was a delightful conversation.
Thank you.
And thank you, Vishal, for making this possible.
Thank you, sir. Thank you for you come and talk about the forest economy, and I hope Venki, you will take the idea and what the initiative Prof is doing through matlab, to the entire agripreneurs community,
Sure,
which you
sure.
are like yeah.
Yeah.
And maybe in terms of collaboration, as Prof are open for collaboration, who wants to collaborate, who wants to be part of this initiative as for the forest economy. So there are multiple agripreneurs and agri startups who are working in the technology sector or mechanized sector. They can also come and uh, what talk and see how they can contribute this to foster the forest economy.
Yes. So, I mean, what Vishal
I
is.
agree.
Yeah. Just to add to Vishal's is, Vishal is also one of the moderators for this community that we all been co-creating and running, which is a community of about 250 plus agri entrepreneurs. So that we would love to see more. If there's some ways where you think this group of entrepreneurs could come in and help in there, we would love to contribute in there. So yeah. Sorry, please.
Oh, I see a lot of affinity. Sort of these are seeds, right? Whether they are grown on the farm or collected in the forest, one way or the other, you have to mill them, you have to grind them, you have to dry them, you have to pack them. The technology needs to be customized, but there is great affinity. A lot of work has already been done, so we should not be reinventing those wheels at least. Some wheels will have to be invented, but many of them just need to be customized.
Yeah, no, definitely. A lot of the technologies around organizing around for village level economies and first level invisible migration aggregation costs, all of that have largely been addressed in many pockets.
Exactly.
So it has to be plugged into at an API level and then rapidly scaled across at many levels. So completely agree on that. So yeah, hoping for that kind of collaboration to further happen. So on that note, thank you very much. It was really a pleasure. Thank you.
You're welcome.